In the winter of 1937, a quiet river valley just south of Madrid was about to become the epicenter of the Spanish Civil War. You had two armies, and here's the thing, each was planning its own decisive blow. They were on a collision course. So, in this analysis, we're going to break down the strategic prelude to the Battle of Jarama. We'll look at the plans, the forces in play, and the ground itself that would define one of the conflict's most brutal and pivotal engagements.
Now, everything we're about to cover is grounded in the incredibly detailed research of Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo of the Spanish Army. You can find his work at batallasguerracivil.es. It gives us a really solid military historical foundation to understand exactly what was about to unfold.
All right, here's how we'll break this down. First, we'll cover the strategic stalemate in Madrid that set the whole thing up. Then, we'll look at the Nationalist plan to encircle the city, followed immediately by the Republicans' own plan for a counteroffensive. From there, we'll assess the forces on both sides, analyze the battlefield, and then bring it all together to see the situation right on the eve of the battle.
So, first up, the strategic stalemate. How did we even get to Jarama? Well, it all goes back to Madrid. By late 1936, the Nationalists' initial headlong assault on the capital had been stopped cold. The war of movement was over, and it was replaced by this brutal, grinding deadlock that forced both sides to completely rethink their strategy.
The real turning point came on November 23, 1936. That's when Franco officially called off the frontal assault on Madrid. And that decision, well, it was a huge admission that the dream of a quick war was over. The conflict now fractured into four major theaters, but as you can see right here, the central front around Madrid was still the undisputed center of gravity. This is where the war was going to be won or lost.
So, around Madrid, this tense equilibrium set in. On one hand, you have the Republicans. They've got the numbers, new brigades are being formed all the time, and their morale is sky high after holding the city. But on the other hand, the Nationalists had this decisive edge in quality. Their troops from the Army of Africa, these were seasoned, battle-hardened professionals. The problem? These elite units were absolutely exhausted and dangerously overstretched. Okay, so with the front door to Madrid slammed shut, General Mola and the Nationalist command had to pivot. They shifted from a strategy of frontal assault to one of maneuver. The new goal wasn't to storm the city itself, but to cut its lifelines and essentially starve it into surrender. And this is where you really see the operational ambition of their new plan. Mola envisioned this massive envelopment east of Madrid. The main effort would push from the south, force a crossing over the Jarama River, and then hook northeast towards the real strategic prize, Alcalá de Henares. If they could take that, they'd sever the vital road and rail links to Valencia, and Madrid would be completely cut off from the rest of Republican Spain.
The op was laid out in three clear phases. Phase 1, a fast advance to seize a bridgehead over the Jarama. Phase 2, exploit that crossing and drive hard for Alcalá de Henares. And Phase 3, link up with a secondary attack from the north moving on Guadalajara. You see, the critical assumption driving this whole thing was their belief that cutting that Valencia road would be the mortal blow, that it would trigger a total strategic collapse of the Madrid front.
But here's the thing. The Nationalists weren't planning in a vacuum. In what is just a remarkable historical coincidence, the Republican High Command was, at that exact same time, drawing up its own major offensive, and it was aimed at the very same piece of ground, but with a completely mirrored objective.
General Pozas, who was commanding the Republican Army of the Center, was planning to strike west from the east bank of the Jarama. His objective was to slice right into the exposed Nationalist flank and cut their main line of supply, the National Highway 5. This move wouldn't just relieve the pressure on Madrid, it had the potential to actually trap the entire besieging force. So you've got two armies, two offensive plans converging on one battlefield. You know, the Republican plan actually started out as just a limited spoiling attack, but it quickly grew into this much more ambitious operation, and crucially, their intelligence was starting to pick up on the enemy's moves. Observers in Madrid were reporting significant troop movements from west to east, which all but confirmed a Nationalist attack was coming. The problem was their own preparations were getting bogged down by command friction and delays. So, this all brings us to the armies themselves. What we're seeing here is the setup for a classic military matchup. It's the professional quality of the Nationalists against the sheer numbers of the Republic. Let's dig into the forces each side was bringing to the table.
On one side, you have the Nationalist Maneuver Force. These guys were a hardened, professional fighting machine with a solid command structure. But, and this is a big but, they had virtually no operational reserves. On the other side, the Republican Army of the Center had a clear advantage in manpower, but it was an army mostly made up of newly formed brigades that were inexperienced, undertrained, and often lacking in both men and equipment. This order of battle really tells the story of the nationalist advantage. They called it the Reinforced Division of Madrid, but for all intents and purposes, this was a small army corps. Just look at its core units, the Banderas of the Spanish Foreign Legion, the Tabors of Moroccan Regulares. We're talking about the absolute professional elite of the Nationalist Army, organized into 5 hard-hitting brigades. This gave them an enormous qualitative edge. Now compare that to the Republican order of battle. On paper, the Madrid Army Corps looks impressive, right? Multiple divisions, dozens of brigades. It looks powerful. But the reality on the ground was that these mixed brigades were brand new formations, hastily thrown together. They had little time for training, were often led by inexperienced officers, and had serious gaps in everything from machine guns to communication. Of course, beyond the men and their plans, there was a third major factor that was going to play a decisive role here: the ground itself. The topography of the Jarama Valley was going to channel the fighting and heavily influence every tactical decision made. So let's do a quick terrain analysis. You can really break the battlefield down into 3 distinct zones. To the west, where the Nationalists were set to attack from, you have an open, rolling plateau. It's almost perfect ground for an advance with armor. The center is the Jarama River Valley itself, a flat, 3-kilometer-wide obstacle. And then rising steeply from the eastern bank is another plateau. So the key takeaway here is how the terrain favored each side. That western plateau was ideal for the attacker. But the river valley, with only a few bridges, was a natural bottleneck that was going to canalize any assault. And that eastern escarpment, with commanding heights, like the infamous El Pingarrón, offered the Republican defenders an absolutely superb natural fortress to dominate the entire valley below. And that brings us to the eve of battle. By February 6, 1937, the strategic stage is set. The plans are finalized, the forces are in motion, and you have 2 armies, each convinced of its own offensive design, on an unavoidable collision course. This map shows you the final dispositions. The Nationalists are going to strike first, no question. They held the initiative. But critically, Republican intelligence had given them just enough warning. They were already moving reserves to meet the threat. And what this means is that the Nationalists weren't just going to achieve a simple breakthrough. They were about to advance directly into the teeth of a forming defense, into a major head-on battle. And that's exactly why Jarama is so significant. This wasn't going to be another desperate house-to-house fight in the suburbs of Madrid. As our source material points out, this was the first true open-field battle between the 2 developing armies of the Spanish Civil War. It was a test of maneuver, of doctrine, of command, in a way that simply hadn't happened yet. Which leaves us with the fundamental strategic question hanging over the battlefield on that February morning. Could the qualitatively superior nationalist force, with a plan totally dependent on speed and shock, but critically lacking any reserves, actually achieve its strategic objectives before the numerically superior but much greener Republican army could bring its full weight to bear and grind the whole offensive to a halt?